September 14th, 1989. A Thursday morning in Cedar Falls, a quiet town where neighbors still left their doors unlocked and children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. That morning, 9-year-old Michael Patterson kissed his mother goodbye, grabbed his blue Schwinn bicycle, and pedaled toward Franklin Elementary School. He never arrived. By noon, Sarah Patterson knew something was wrong. Michael was never late. He never missed school. She called the police at 12:47 p.m. By nightfall, 300 volunteers were combing through woods, checking drainage ditches, knocking on doors. The search lasted 6 weeks. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a backpack, not a trace. The case went cold. Months turned into years. The Pattersons moved away. The volunteers returned to their lives. Cedar Falls tried to forget. But on March 3rd, 2004, 15 years, 5 months, and 17 days after Michael vanished, a construction crew breaking ground on a new shopping center made a discovery that would shatter everything everyone thought they knew. They found his bicycle, buried 12 feet underground, in a location that had been searched 4 times in 1989. But this wasn't just a bicycle. This was evidence of something methodical, something calculated, something that suggested Michael Patterson's disappearance wasn't random at all. What happened during those 15 years? Why was the bike buried where dozens of searchers had already looked? And why did 3 people connected to this case refuse to speak to investigators when the bicycle surfaced? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Narrator. This is a story of how one piece of evidence reopened a case that law enforcement had abandoned. How a small town's darkest secret was protected by silence, and how the truth about Michael Patterson would challenge everything we think we know about the people we trust most. 3 questions haunted investigators when they reopened this case in 2004. First, if Michael disappeared on his way to school, why was his bicycle found 3 miles in the opposite direction, in an area that wasn't on his route? Second, the bike was buried beneath soil layers that forensic geologists dated to the early 1990s, at least 2 years after Michael vanished. Who moved it, and why? Third, why did Robert Hendricks, the local hardware store owner who organized the 1989 search parties, suddenly sell his business and leave town within days of the bicycle being discovered? The answers will reveal a conspiracy of protection, a community that chose comfort over truth, and a timeline that investigators had gotten completely wrong from the very beginning. To understand what really happened, we need to go back to Cedar Falls in the summer of 1989, when the town was preparing for its centennial celebration, when everyone knew everyone, when trust was currency, and when one man was hiding in plain sight. Narrator. Cedar Falls, population 3,200, nestled in the valley between Route 47 and the Clearwater River. In 1989, it was the kind of place people moved to, not away from. The kind of place where your 3rd-grade teacher was also your neighbor, where the pharmacy owner knew your allergies before you did. Michael Patterson was ordinary in the most extraordinary way. He collected baseball cards. He hated broccoli. He wanted to be an astronaut. His mother, Sarah, worked as a nurse at Cedar Falls General Hospital. His father, David, was a long-haul truck driver, gone 2 weeks out of every month. Michael was an only child. His best friend was a golden retriever named Copper. The Patterson house sat on Maple Street, exactly 1.7 miles from Franklin Elementary School. Michael knew the route by heart. Left on Maple, right on Oak Avenue, straight through Veterans Park, left on School Street, 8 minutes on his bicycle. He'd done it hundreds of times. But Michael had another route, one his mother didn't know about, one that added 15 minutes to his journey, but took him past something that fascinated him, the old Riverside construction site, where developers had abandoned the strip mall project after running out of funding. Michael and his classmates would stop there, exploring the concrete foundations, the steel beams, the mystery of something left unfinished. On September 13th, 1989, the day before Michael disappeared, his 4th-grade teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, kept him after class. She'd noticed bruising on his left arm. Michael told her he'd fallen off his bike. She didn't believe him. She filed a report with the school counselor, noting her concerns. That report would vanish from school records. It wouldn't resurface until 2004. That same week, Robert Hendricks was the most respected man in Cedar Falls, owner of Hendricks Hardware for 23 years, Little League coach, Rotary Club president. He was organizing the town's centennial parade, scheduled for October 7th. Everyone knew Robert. Everyone trusted Robert. Parents left their children at his store while they ran errands. He had a playroom in the back, filled with toys and comic books. Robert Hendricks had no criminal record, no complaints, no red flags. He was married to Linda, a kindergarten teacher. They had no children of their own. When investigators would later interview former employees, they would describe him as generous, patient, always willing to help. But Thomas Brennan remembers something different. Thomas worked at Hendricks Hardware in the summer of 1989. He was 16. In a 2005 interview, Thomas recalled something odd. Robert kept a detailed log of which children visited the store's playroom. Names, times, how long they stayed. When Thomas asked about it, Robert said it was for insurance purposes. Thomas didn't question it. Why would he? Another detail would emerge years later. In August 1989, just weeks before Michael disappeared, the Cedar Falls Police Department received an anonymous call. A woman reported seeing Robert Hendricks driving slowly through Veterans Park after dark, watching children. An officer drove by the park that evening, saw nothing unusual, filed no report. The tip was forgotten. Michael Patterson's final day began normally. Sarah made him pancakes. David was in Ohio, 3 days into a 2-week haul. Michael wore his favorite red jacket, the one with NASA patches his uncle had given him. He loaded his backpack. At 7:42 a.m., Sarah watched from the kitchen window as Michael pedaled down Maple Street. She never saw him again. By 8:15 a.m., Michael hadn't arrived at school. Mrs. Hartwell marked him absent. She thought about the bruises. She thought about calling. She didn't. At 10:30 a.m., the school secretary called Sarah Patterson to confirm Michael's absence. Sarah's heart stopped. Sarah left work immediately. She drove his route. She checked Veterans Park, the construction site. She called David's trucking dispatcher. By noon, she was at the Cedar Falls Police Department, filing a missing person report. Officer James Morrison took her statement. He assured her Michael probably got distracted. Kids do that. He'd turn up. But by 4 p.m., when Michael still hadn't come home, the town mobilized. Robert Hendricks was the first to volunteer. He organized search teams, divided the town into grids, coordinated with the fire department. For 6 weeks, Robert Hendricks led the search for Michael Patterson. Search party footage style recreation. Flashlights in woods. They searched everywhere, except one place. Aerial view of construction site. Slow zoom. The abandoned Riverside construction site, where Michael liked to explore, had been searched on day 2. Officers walked the perimeter, checked the foundations, found nothing. It was crossed off the list. In 2004, when the bicycle was found, investigators realized something that made their blood run cold. Ground-penetrating radar imagery. That site had never been fully excavated. The search teams had only examined what was visible above ground. What lay beneath had remained untouched for 15 years. Calendar pages flipping. September 1989. September 14th, 1989. 7:42 a.m. Michael Patterson left home on his blue Schwinn bicycle. According to the original investigation, this is what authorities believe happened. Michael took his normal route. Somewhere between Maple Street and Franklin Elementary, someone intercepted him. There was no struggle, no witnesses, no evidence. He simply vanished. But that timeline was built on an assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong. In 2004, when Detective Rachel Morrison, no relation to the original officer, reopened the case, she discovered something the 1989 investigation had missed. At 7:55 a.m. on September 14th, a Cedar Falls resident named Helen Crosby was walking her dog near the intersection of Oak Avenue and 3rd Street. She saw a boy matching Michael's description, riding his bicycle. But he wasn't heading toward school. He was heading toward the Riverside construction site. Helen had reported this in 1989. Her statement was filed and ignored. Why? Because it didn't fit the prevailing theory. Officers assumed Helen was mistaken about the time or the direction. They dismissed her. In 2004, Detective Morrison tracked Helen down. Now 78 years old, Helen remembered every detail. "I remember because I thought it was odd," Helen said. "That boy was pedaling fast, like he was late for something. But school was the other direction. I almost called out to him." She didn't. If Helen was right, Michael had deviated from his route deliberately. He was going somewhere specific. The construction site was 3/10 of a mile from where Helen saw him. At Michael's normal cycling speed, he would have arrived there at approximately 8:03 a.m. Detective Morrison ran the timeline again. Michael left home at 7:42 a.m. Helen saw him at 7:55 a.m. heading toward the construction site. He should have arrived by 8:03 a.m. School started at 8:15 a.m. Michael knew he'd be late. So why was he going there? Morrison found something else. In the weeks before his disappearance, Michael had been late to school 4 times. Each time, he arrived flushed out of breath, making excuses about stopping to help a neighbor or finding a lost dog. Mrs. Hartwell had documented this. She noted, "Michael seems distracted. Something is bothering him." Morrison had a theory. Michael was meeting someone he knew, someone he trusted enough to make him late for school, someone connected to that construction site. The Riverside construction site had been abandoned in 1987 after the development company declared bankruptcy. The property sat in legal limbo, technically owned by Cedar Falls Savings and Loan. But here's what Morrison discovered. In 1988, 1 year before Michael disappeared, Robert Hendricks had submitted a bid to purchase the property. The bank had rejected it. In his bid documents, Hendricks outlined plans to turn the site into a community recreation center. Why was Robert Hendricks interested in that specific property? Morrison dug deeper. She found that Hendricks had visited the construction site regularly in 1988 and 1989. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing his truck there. When asked why, Hendricks always said the same thing. He was evaluating it for potential purchase. But Morrison discovered something that changed everything. In July 1989, 2 months before Michael disappeared, a construction worker doing an unrelated survey of the property found something disturbing: a makeshift shelter built inside one of the concrete foundation pits. It contained a sleeping bag, canned food, children's toys, and a portable radio. The worker reported it to local police. Officer Morrison, James Morrison, who would later take Sarah Patterson's missing person report, drove out to investigate. He photographed the items. He filed a report noting possible squatters or transients. He removed the items. He never followed up. That report gathered dust for 15 years. In 2004, Detective Rachel Morrison located those items in the police department's storage facility. When she examined them, she found something James Morrison had missed in 1989. Fingerprints. Multiple sets. They'd never been processed. Rachel Morrison sent them to the state crime lab. 3 weeks later, she got results. One set of prints belonged to Michael Patterson. They were on a comic book found in that shelter. The comic book was dated August 1989. Michael had been at that construction site within weeks of his disappearance. But there was a second set of prints on the sleeping bag, on a flashlight, on canned food containers. Those prints belonged to Robert Hendricks. Rachel Morrison now had evidence that Michael Patterson and Robert Hendricks had both been at that construction site before Michael disappeared. But she had no evidence of what happened on September 14th, 1989. Until the bicycle changed everything. Before we continue, I need to know, are you starting to piece this together? Drop a comment right now with your theory about what happened. And tell us where you're watching from. We're reading every single one. The blue Schwinn bicycle was found on March 3rd, 2004, buried 12 feet underground at the northwest corner of the Riverside construction site. The burial location was inside one of the original concrete foundation pits. the same area where the makeshift shelter had been found in 1989. Forensic analysis revealed something that made no sense. The soil layers above the bicycle dated to 1991 or 1992, at least 2 years after Michael disappeared. Someone had buried the bicycle years after crime. But there was more. The bicycle's chain had been deliberately broken. The handlebars were bent backward, and wrapped around the frame, preserved by the clay soil, was a piece of fabric, red fabric, NASA patches still visible. It was Michael's jacket, the one he was wearing the morning he disappeared. When news of the bicycle's discovery reached Cedar Falls on March 4th, 2004, the town that had tried to forget suddenly had to remember. Sarah Patterson, now living 2 states away, got the call from Detective Rachel Morrison at 6:30 a.m. "We found something," Morrison said. "I need you to come back." Sarah Patterson hadn't been to Cedar Falls in 12 years. Her marriage to David had collapsed in 1993, the weight of grief finally breaking what was left. David died in 1998, his heart giving out at 52. Sarah had built a new life, a new name, a new history where she didn't have to explain why she checked every missing child report, why she couldn't walk past playgrounds, why September 14th was the day she stopped living. Sarah identified the bicycle immediately. She identified the jacket. She collapsed in the Cedar Falls Police Department conference room. 15 years of suspended grief finally released. Detective Morrison had already begun building her case. The bicycle discovery had triggered a full forensic review. Ground-penetrating radar scanned the entire construction site. On March 7th, for days after finding the bicycle, technicians detected an anomaly. 18 feet from where the bicycle was buried, at a depth of 9 feet, the radar showed a void. Something was down there, something approximately 4 feet long. Excavation team. Careful work. On March 9th, 2004, excavators carefully removed soil from the anomaly location. At 2:47 p.m., they found human remains. Police tape. Crowd gathering. The skeleton was incomplete, small, consistent with a child aged 8 to 10. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the skull. Time of death, impossible to determine exactly, but consistent with 1989 or early 1990. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains were Michael Patterson. He'd been less than 3 miles from his home for 15 years, buried at a site that had been searched multiple times. But here's what it makes sense. The 1989 search teams had walked over this exact area. They'd photographed it. How had they missed a fresh grave? The answer came from forensic geology. In September 1989, this section of the construction site had been covered by temporary plywood panels, placed there by the bank to prevent accidents. The panels were weathered, partially covered with debris, and had been there for over a year. Search teams in 1989 had noted the panels but hadn't removed them. They assumed nothing could be underneath structures that predated Michael's disappearance. They were wrong. Someone had removed those panels, dug into the ground beneath them, buried Michael, and then replaced the panels perfectly. The deception was meticulous. It suggested planning, familiarity with the site, access to equipment. Morrison's theory: Michael was killed on September 14, 1989, probably in the morning. His body was buried quickly, shallowly, somewhere temporary. Then, months or years later, someone moved him to this carefully prepared grave. They'd waited. They'd watched. They'd found the perfect hiding place beneath structures that gave them cover. All roads led back to Robert Hendricks, the man who'd led the search, the man whose fingerprints were at the site, the man who'd tried to buy this property, the man who'd left town the week the bicycle was found. On March 12, 2004, Detective Morrison obtained a warrant to search Robert Hendricks' property. He'd moved to a town called Millbrook, 200 miles away. In 2004, just days after the bicycle discovery, he'd sold his hardware store through a lawyer. He hadn't returned to Cedar Falls. Officers arrived at 6 a.m. Robert Hendricks answered the door in pajamas. He was 67 years old, gray hair, trembling hands. He looked at the warrant and said 6 words: "I've been waiting for this." The interrogation lasted 9 hours. Robert Hendricks sat across from Detective Morrison and said nothing for the first 40 minutes. Then he asked for coffee. He drank it slowly. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't kill Michael Patterson," he said. Morrison waited. "But I know who did." What Robert Hendricks revealed over the next 8 hours would crack open not just Michael's case, but 15 years of small-town secrets. He started with a name, Gerald Vance. Gerald Vance had worked at Hendricks Hardware from 1985 to 1990. He was quiet, efficient, good with customers. He'd helped Robert organize the centennial celebration. He'd volunteered for the search parties. In 1990, Gerald Vance had moved to Florida. In 1997, Gerald Vance had died in a car accident. Gerald had a problem. Hendricks told Morrison. He liked children. Too much. I suspected it for years. I saw how he watched them in the store. I heard things, rumors, but I never had proof. I didn't want to believe it. Morrison leaned forward. "Tell me about September 14th, 1989. Hendricks took a breath. "Gerald called me that morning, around 8:30. He was panicking, crying. He said there had been an accident. He needed my help. He begged me." "What kind of accident?" "He said a boy had fallen. At the construction site. He said the boy wasn't breathing." According to Hendricks, he drove to the construction site immediately. When he arrived around 8:50 a.m., he found Gerald standing over Michael Patterson's body. Michael was already dead. His head was bleeding. His bicycle was nearby, mangled. Gerald was in shock, Hendricks said. He kept saying it was an accident, that Michael had shown up unexpectedly, that they'd argued, that Michael tried to leave, and Gerald grabbed him, and Michael fell and hit his head on the concrete. Morrison didn't believe the accident story. Neither did Hendricks. The autopsy had shown multiple blows to Michael's skull. Not a single fall. Not an accident. Murder. Why didn't you call the police? Morrison asked. Hendricks was silent for a long time. When he finally answered, his voice was barely a whisper. Because Gerald knew things about me. Things I'd done. Not to children. Never to children. But things that would ruin me. Financial fraud. Tax evasion. I'd been skimming from the business for years. Gerald had figured it out. He had evidence. He said if I helped him, he'd destroy it. If I didn't, he'd turn me in. So Robert Hendricks made a choice. He helped Gerald Vance cover up a murder to protect himself from prison. Together, they buried Michael Patterson in a shallow grave beneath the plywood panels. They cleaned the scene. They hid the bicycle in Gerald's truck. Then Robert Hendricks went home and waited for Sarah Patterson to report her son missing. When the search started, I volunteered immediately. Hendricks said, I thought if I let it, I could control it. Make sure no one looked too carefully at the construction site. It worked. For 6 weeks, Robert Hendricks organized searches everywhere except where Michael actually was. When people suggested searching construction site more thoroughly, he steered them away. We already checked there, he'd say. We need to expand our radius. The case went cold. Gerald Vance moved to Florida in 1990. Before leaving, he and Hendricks returned to construction site one final time. They dug Michael up from a shallow grave. They buried him deeper, in a more permanent location. They buried his bicycle nearby. They replaced the plywood. They covered their tracks. Why did you leave town in 2004? Morrison asked. Because when that construction crew started digging, I knew they'd find him. I knew it was over. I couldn't face Sarah Patterson. I couldn't face this town. Detective Morrison had Hendricks' confession, but there was a problem. Gerald Vance was dead. There was no way to verify Hendricks' story. No way to confirm that Gerald was a killer, and Hendricks was merely an accessory after the fact. Morrison suspected Hendricks was lying, that he'd killed Michael himself, and was blaming a dead man who couldn't defend himself. She needed proof. She needed something Gerald Vance or Robert Hendricks had left behind. She went back to the construction site. For 2 weeks in March 2004, forensic teams excavated every inch of the Riverside construction site. They were looking for anything that might confirm or contradict Robert Hendricks' story. Tools, clothing, DNA evidence, anything. On March 24th, they found it, buried 3 feet from Michael's final grave, wrapped in deteriorated plastic, was a metal lockbox. Inside the box, photographs, dozens of them, Polaroids, children in various states of undress, children who looked uncomfortable, frightened. The photographs were dated. The earliest was from 1984. The latest was from September 1989. But it wasn't the photographs that broke the case open. It was what was written on the back of them. Names, dates, locations, in handwriting that forensic analysts would later confirm belonged to Gerald Vance. Among the photographs was one dated September 12, 1989, 2 days before Michael disappeared. The photograph showed Michael Patterson at the construction site. He was alive. He was clothed, but he looked afraid. On the back, in Gerald Vance's handwriting, MP, getting difficult, threatening to tell, problem. Michael Patterson hadn't been lured to the construction site on September 14th. He'd been going there for weeks, possibly months. Gerald Vance had been grooming him, and when Michael finally tried to stop it, tried to resist, tried to tell someone, Gerald Vance had killed him. The lockbox contained one more piece of evidence, a letter dated September 13th, 1989, written by Gerald Vance, never sent. It was addressed to Robert Hendricks. In the letter, Gerald confessed everything, his attraction to children, his years of abuse, his fear that Michael was going to expose him. He wrote, "If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I need your help, Robert. You're the only one I can trust. Please don't let me down." Robert Hendricks had been telling the truth. He hadn't killed Michael Patterson, but his decision to help cover up the murder had let a predator escape. Gerald Vance had moved to Florida, where he lived freely for 7 more years before dying in that car accident. How many other children had he hurt in those 7 years? That question would haunt Hendricks for the rest of his life. Detective Morrison contacted Florida authorities. They reviewed unsolved cases from 1990 to 1997, 3 missing children in Gerald Vance's area. None ever found. No evidence linking Vance. But the timing was impossible to ignore. On April 2nd, 2004, Robert Hendricks was charged with accessory to murder after the fact, tamper with evidence, and obstruction of justice. He pleaded guilty to all charges. At his sentencing hearing, Sarah Patterson sat in the front row. Hendricks addressed her directly. "I can't ask for your forgiveness," he said. "I don't deserve it. I was a coward. I chose my reputation over your son's life. I chose my freedom over justice. Every day since September 14th, 1989, I've lived with what I did, but my suffering is nothing compared to yours. I'm sorry is enough. It will never be enough." Sarah Patterson didn't respond. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply watched as Robert Hendricks was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He would die there in 2019 at age 82, having served 15 years. The case of Michael Patterson was officially closed. Gerald Vance was posthumously identified as the primary perpetrator. Robert Hendricks was the accomplice who'd helped hide the truth. Justice had been served, or so everyone thought. Rachel Morrison couldn't let it go. Something about the case bothered her. She'd review the evidence at night, searching for whatever was nagging at her subconscious. And then, 6 months after Hendricks' sentencing, she found it. The soil analysis from Michael's grave showed disturbance layers from 2 different time periods. The first was consistent with September 1989, when Michael was initially buried. The second was from 1991 or 1992, when he was moved to the deeper grave. This matched Hendricks' story. But there was a third disturbance layer. From 2003, 1 year before the bicycle was found. Someone had been at Michael's grave in 2003. Someone had dug down, but not all the way to the remains, then refilled the hole. Why? Morrison went back to the construction site timeline. In 2003, the property had finally been purchased by a development company. They'd started preliminary surveys for the shopping center that would eventually break ground in 2004. During those surveys, someone must have discovered something. Morrison obtained the 2003 survey records. 12 workers had been on site. She interviewed all of them. 11 had no memory of anything unusual. The 12th had left the company in 2004. He'd moved to Canada. It took Morrison 3 weeks to track him down. His name was Daniel Foster. When Morrison finally reached her by phone, she asked a simple question. Did you find something at the Riverside site in 2003? Silence. Then, how did you know? Daniel Foster had been running ground-penetrating radar. In August 2003, when he detected the anomaly, he dug down 6 feet. He'd seen a piece of blue metal. He'd recognized it immediately. It was a handlebar of a bicycle. He knew about the Michael Patterson case. Everyone in Cedar Falls did. Why didn't you report it? Morrison asked. Because I called my supervisor, Foster said, and he told me to stop digging. He said we couldn't afford delays. He said if we reported a possible burial site, the project would be shut down for months. He told me to fill the hole back in and forget what I saw. So I did. The supervisor was a man named Richard Pelletier. Morrison looked into his background. Pelletier had lived in Cedar Falls from 1985 to 1995. He'd been a construction worker. He'd worked on various projects around town, including, in 1988, a brief contract at the Riverside site before it was abandoned. Pelletier had known the site well. He'd known its layout, its hiding places. And in 2003, when his company was contracted to survey the property, he'd realized what might be buried there. Maybe he'd suspected all along. Maybe he'd seen something back in 1989 or the early 1990s. Maybe he'd kept quiet for the same reason Robert Hendricks had, because revealing the truth would destroy his own life. Rachel Morrison drove to Pelletier's home in April 2005. She knocked on his door. When he answered, she showed him her badge and said, "We need to talk about what you covered up in 2003. Pelletier looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I was protecting my family's legacy." What Pelletier revealed changed everything one final time. In 1989, Richard Pelletier's father, Martin Pelletier, had been the bank manager at Cedar Falls Savings and Loan, the bank that owned the Riverside construction site. Martin Pelletier had rejected Robert Hendricks' bid to purchase the property. He'd kept the property in the bank's portfolio for years, refusing multiple offers. Why? Because Martin Pelletier had seen something at that site in late 1989. He'd been conducting a routine property inspection in October, after Michael disappeared, but while the search was still active, he'd found disturbed soil beneath the plywood panels. He'd noticed fresh tool marks on the panels. He'd suspected something was wrong. But Martin Pelletier had made the same calculation as Robert Hendricks. If something terrible had happened at that site, and the bank owned it, the liability would be catastrophic. The bank was already struggling financially. A scandal would destroy it. 200 families had accounts there. Loans, mortgages, life savings. Martin Pelletier had chosen the bank over the truth. He'd kept the property undeveloped. When he died in 1998, his son Richard had inherited the secret. In 2003, when Richard's surveyor found the bicycle, Richard had made the same choice his father had: bury the truth, protect the family. Richard Pelletier was charged with obstruction of justice. He pleaded guilty. At his sentencing, he addressed Sarah Patterson, who once again sat in the courtroom. "My father thought he was protecting the town," Richard said. "I thought I was protecting his memory. We were both wrong. I'm sorry." Sarah Patterson stood up. For 15 years, she'd been silent. Now, finally, she spoke. 3 men knew my son was buried at that site. 3 men chose their own interests over bringing him home. You talk about protection, about legacies, about difficult choices. But you all had one choice. You had the truth, and you buried it along with my boy. Richard Pelletier received 5 years. He would serve 3 before being released in 2008. The case of Michael Patterson was closed for the second time, this time truly closed. Today, there's a small park in Cedar Falls where the Riverside construction site used to be. The shopping center was never built. After the investigation, the property was donated to the town. They turned it into a memorial garden. At its center stands a bronze statue of a boy on a bicycle. Michael Patterson's name is there. So are the names of 3 children from Florida who went missing between 1990 and 1997. Gerald Vance was never charged with their disappearances, but their families wanted them remembered alongside Michael, connected by the same man, the same silence, the same failure. Sarah Patterson visits the memorial twice a year. On Michael's birthday, June 12th, and on September 14th, the day she lost him, she brings his favorite flowers, yellow sunflowers, and she sits on the bench that faces his statue. In a 2019 interview, she was asked if she'd found peace. Interview footage. Sarah, older now. Peace? She said. No, I don't think I'll ever have that. But I have something I didn't have for 15 years. I have answers. I know where my son is. I know what happened to him. I know he didn't suffer for long. And I know he was brave enough to try to stop what was happening to him. That takes courage most adults don't have. 3 men protected their secrets for 15 years. Gerald Vance, who took his secrets to the grave. Robert Hendricks, who lived with guilt until it consumed him. Richard Pelletier, who inherited a lie and chose to maintain it. All 3 valued their own preservation over a mother's right to bury her child. This case forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many people knew something was wrong but stayed silent? How many times did someone notice something off about Gerald Vance but dismissed it? How many red flags were ignored because confronting them would be inconvenient? And here's the hardest question. Would you have had the courage to speak up? Or would you have been the 4th person who chose silence? This story isn't unique. It's a pattern that repeats across communities everywhere. If you want to understand how these patterns work, how predators hide in plain sight, and how systems fail to protect the most vulnerable, check out our next story about a teacher who everyone trusted for 20 years, until one student finally found the courage to tell the truth. What's your take on this case? Should Richard Pelletier have received more time? Should Martin Pelletier's legacy have been publicly exposed even after his death? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We're reading every single one, and we want to hear your perspective. If the story affected you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to understand why speaking up matters. And subscribe so you never miss these important true stories that challenge us to think about justice, truth, and the choices we make when no one's watching. For Michael Patterson, who never made it to school that September morning, may his story remind us that silence is never neutral. It always protects someone. The question is, who are you protecting?